All right, let's jump into this deep dive into hammock camping. Looks like we've got a pretty interesting mix of sources this time around. We've got that good old Wikipedia article on hammock camping, some forest safety guidelines to keep us grounded in reality, and then, well, this is fun, a YouTube video all about sleeping in that video game, The Forest.
Yeah, that's a pretty unique combo for sure. I'm actually pretty curious to see how those real world tips in that virtual world, how they kind of come together.
Exactly. And that's what we're here for. By the end of this, you'll not only know the basics of hammock camping, but also get a fresh perspective from, well, that unexpected gaming source. Let's kick things off with what might be on everyone's mind if you're new to all this. What exactly is hammock camping? And why are folks choosing to sleep, suspended in the air instead of on good old solid ground?
Well, the Wikipedia article actually points out that it's more than just a kind of quirky way to camp. It's about comfort, it's about lessening your impact on the environment, and it's about being able to set up camp in spots where a traditional tent might struggle, like on rocky terrain or uneven ground.
It seems like that comfort factor. That's a
Yeah.
big draw for a lot of people. And we actually have this blog post here, Your First Night Sleeping in the Forest. It really emphasizes how much sleeping in a hammock can actually lead to a surprisingly good night's sleep.
Yeah, and it makes sense when you think about it. I mean, no rocks digging into your back, no uneven ground. You're just gently swaying, cocooned in your hammock.
Like a human burrito.
Exactly.
Okay, you've sold me on the comfort factor. But are there any downsides? Anything we should be aware of before we all go running out to buy hammocks?
Of course, every camping style has its pluses and minuses. The Wikipedia article does mention staying warm as a potential challenge with hammocks. Since your sleeping bag is kind of compressed underneath you, it loses some of its insulation effectiveness.
So you can't just bring any old sleeping bag. You need something specific for hammock camping.
You're right, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation, but there are solutions. And luckily, pretty good ones. Hammock campers often use a system of a top quilt and an underquilt. They're basically like sleeping bags, but designed specifically for hammocks. They provide insulation from both above and below, so you stay toasty even on chilly nights.
So problem solved. Now what about finding suitable trees? That seems like it could be a limitation.
Yeah, it's true that you do need two sturdy trees that are spaced just right to hang your hammock. And the Wikipedia article does acknowledge that this can be a bit tricky at higher elevations, where trees might be sparser or maybe not as robust.
So what happens then? Do you just have to pack up and go home?
Not at all. Smart hammock campers always have a backup plan,
Which is,
a lightweight ground sheet.
oh, that makes sense.
If you can't find those perfect trees, you can just use your hammock like a ground tent.
So you've always got options. I love that adaptability. Speaking of options, let's talk gear for a minute. We've got some pretty detailed info here about hammock suspension systems. And tarpaulins, or tarps as most people call them, it sounds like hammock campers have a lot to choose from.
They really do, and it can get pretty technical if you let it. But let's break it down so it's actually helpful, all right? When it comes to suspension, you're basically connecting your hammock to the trees. The most basic setup uses ropes and carabiners, but a lot of hammock campers like to customize with lighter and stronger materials like Dyneema.
And this is where those whoopee slings come into play. Those things look pretty intense.
Exactly. And all those fancy knots, it's all about finding a system that's lightweight, strong, and easy to adjust. And then, of course, there's the tarp. It's essential for protecting you from rain, wind, and even too much sun.
I bet there are quite a few tarp options out there too.
You bet there are. We've got info here about different shapes, rectangular, hexagonal, even some asymmetrical designs. And each shape has its own pros and cons. It all depends on the weather you're likely to encounter and how much coverage you want.
So if I'm heading into a super rady area, I'd want a tarp with more coverage.
Yeah.
Maybe even one with a built-in door.
Exactly. And there are all sorts of other cool features you can add, like line tensioners to make setup easier, and even bug nets to keep those pesky mosquitoes away.
Okay, so we've got our hammock hanging, tarp set up, and we're feeling pretty cozy. Now let's talk about safety. We have some really good forest safety guidelines here, and I think it'll be interesting to compare them to what we've learned from The Forest video game.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. I'm ready to see what those virtual woods can teach us about camping in the real world.
Me too. Let's start with campsite selection. The real-world advice focuses on finding a spot that's flat, elevated, and away from any water sources. This helps avoid potential hazards like flooding and minimizes the chances of running into wildlife.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense when you think about it. You want to be as safe and comfortable as possible when you're out in nature.
But in the forest, It seems like you have a lot more freedom. That YouTube video we have suggests you can pretty much plop down your sleeping bag wherever you want, even those makeshift shelters you can build.
It's interesting how the game simplifies things like that. In real life, choosing a good campsite is crucial. But the forest lets you focus more on the survival aspects, less on the nuances of campsite selection.
So realism point goes to the real-world sources. What about food and waste? What do our sources say about that?
Well, again, the real-world advice really emphasizes minimizing your impact and avoiding attracting any unwanted wildlife. We've got info here that stresses the importance of storing your food securely and disposing of any waste properly.
Makes sense. You don't want to end up with a bear sniffing around your campsite because you left some food out. But in the forest, those concerns don't seem to exist.
Nope, the game streamlines those elements, letting you focus on building, crafting, and of course defending yourself against those cannibalistic enemies.
Which brings us to another key difference: wildlife awareness. Our real-world sources really stress understanding animal behavior and taking precautions. There's even specific advice on what to do if you encounter a bear.
That's essential info for any camper, especially if you're venturing into bear country.
Right, but in the game, the threat seems to come more from those fantastical enemies rather than realistic wildlife.
Another point for real-world practicality.
It's just fascinating to see how those survival elements are reflected and then kind of reimagined in a virtual world.
It really shows how games can simulate real-world experiences, but also reinterpret them in interesting ways. And speaking of reinterpreting, let's dive into what's really unique about sleep in the forest. That YouTube video has some surprising details that might make you rethink your whole approach to sleep.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Let's hear what those virtual slumbers are all about.
So, welcome back to our deep dive into, well, sleeping outside, I guess you could say.
Yeah, whether it's suspended between two trees or huddled in some virtual shelter built to keep cannibals away.
We've been talking about hammock camping in the real world and comparing it to the sleep mechanics in the video game, The Forest.
You know, it's kind of striking how even in a game like that, with all its, fantastical elements, there's still that echo of our very human need for shelter, that feeling of security.
It's like whether you're out in the woods making sure your hammock's hung right and your tarp is secure, or you're meticulously building your base in the game and trying to make it cannibal-proof, it all comes back to that basic instinct to create a safe space for ourselves.
And sleep plays a huge role in that. In both the real world and the forest, sleep isn't just about physical rest, it's about mentally recharging, feeling secure so you can tackle whatever comes next.
Totally. A good night's sleep in your hammock, it can leave you feeling refreshed and ready for a hike, or just to enjoy the peace and quiet of the forest.
Then in the game,
Well, they've taken that idea and gone in a whole other direction with it.
it's not just about restoring energy in the forest. According to that YouTube video we have, sleep actually triggers all sorts of events, like rabbits breeding, trees growing back. It even affects how the game progresses.
They've made sleep into this force that shapes the whole game world. Pretty creative, actually.
Makes you wonder if maybe, just maybe, those game mechanics could change how people think about sleep in real life.
It's possible. Maybe it makes them appreciate a good night's rest a little more, even if they're not getting virtual rabbits as a reward.
Okay, but let's bring it back to the real world for a second. We've covered the basics of hammock camping, the gear, the safety tips. But what's it actually like to spend the night in a hammock out in the woods?
That's where that blog post comes in, your first night sleeping in the forest. The writer really captures the whole experience, not just the practical stuff, but the emotions, too.
And it's not just all, blissful swaying under the stars, is it?
No, not always. The writer talks about feeling anxious at first. Those unfamiliar sounds, that sense of vulnerability you can get surrounded by darkness and, nature.
Which honestly is something a lot of first-time campers experience. Hammock or it doesn't matter. It's that feeling of being outside your comfort zone, immersed in a world that doesn't really care about your schedule or your to-do list.
Yeah, but then there's the other side of it, the part the blog captures so well, the incredible beauty of being in nature, watching the stars come out as you fall asleep.
It's that contrast that makes it so powerful. So, potentially transformative. Kind of reminds me of that saying, stars at night.
Are big and bright. Someone's been watching too many westerns.
Maybe. But seriously, there's something about being out in nature, away from everything. It helps you connect with something, something bigger.
It's a feeling you can get from real-world camping and from games like The Forest.
Each one offers its own path to that sense of awe, Okay, before we wrap this up, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier. That sense of community you see with hammock camping.
It's not just a solo activity, is it?
Definitely not. There are whole online forums, social media groups, even entire festivals.
People hanging out, literally.
Yeah, it's like they've found their people, their way of connecting with nature and with each other.
All while suspended a few feet off the ground.
That sense of belonging, that shared experience, is something we all crave, especially these days.
That blog post even recommended bringing a friend along on your first hammock camping trip, like having a built-in support system.
Someone to share the worries and the excitement with.
And hey, maybe that shared experience turns into a lifelong passion for sleeping under the stars.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. From the practical side of setting up a hammock to those almost philosophical thoughts about sleep that the forest brought up.
We've explored the real world and the virtual, showing how both can tap into our desire for shelter, comfort, and that feeling of being recharged.
But before we send you off on your next adventure, whether it's in a hammock or in a video game, we want to leave you with one last thing to think about.
Knowing what you know now about sleep, how might you approach your next camping trip differently? Or even just your everyday sleep routine? Do those mechanics from the forest, those, almost magical benefits they give to sleep, do they make you see your own sleep in a new way?
We'll be right back to wrap up our deep dive in just a moment. Welcome back to our final part, folks. All this hammock talk has got me itching to get outside. Trade this mic for some trees, you know what I mean?
You and me both. Though I might need some practice setting all that stuff up first.
Yeah, no need to rush into the whole human burrito thing.
Exactly.
And maybe we can skip the DIY leaf installation, too.
Those fancy sleeping bags do sound pretty tempting.
But before we get lost in hammock daydreams, let's bring it back to you. You, the listener, who's been with us on this journey through real-world camping. And, well, the unexpected world of sleep in the forest.
So what have we learned? What can you actually take away from all this and use in your own life, whether you're a hardcore camper or just thinking about spending a night under the stars for the first time?
We've covered a lot, that's for sure, from the practical stuff like how to choose the right gear and stay safe in the forest, to why those different tarp shapes matter.
And then we jumped into that video game, The Forest. Who knew a game could make us rethink something as basic as sleep?
Yeah, it's amazing how it sparked all these conversations about getting a good night's rest. And even using sleep to, change your environment, even if it's just a virtual one.
Those unexpected connections, they're what makes these deep dives so fun.
But beyond the tips and tricks, I think we've also touched on something more universal. That human need to connect with nature.
To find some peace and quiet away from everything.
And that's a feeling you can get whether you're in a hammock, a tent, or just sitting by a campfire.
So as we wrap things up here, we encourage you to take what you've learned and make it your own.
Maybe this inspires you to try hammock camping. Or maybe you just see your favorite campsite in a new way.
Or hey, maybe you start paying more attention to your own sleep routine.
To how good it feels to rest, whether you're swaying in a hammock or tucked into your bed at home.
The key takeaway here is simple. Stay curious, keep exploring, and don't underestimate those unexpected connections.
Those aha moments can pop up anywhere. In a game, a blog post, even a conversation with a friend.
And who knows, maybe we'll cross paths someday out on the trail.
Or in a virtual forest somewhere.
Until then, happy camping, everyone.
Sweet dreams.
And keep searching for those moments of wonder that make life so great.